So there's finally some good news and at least some chance for a positive solution in terms of free speech online. After years of repression, censorship, shadow banning, being buried in the algorithm, hidden from view, having subscribers not be recommended content, having search queries impossible to find, in the name of misinformation, and balancing content and protecting users, hiding what's harmful, millions of content creators, publishers, independent journalists, and others have been censored online. It's affected nearly every channel that I've ever followed on the internet. It's affected us personally. It has really stifled dissent. It has really stifled free speech and the sort of free discussion that we should all want in a free society. It's a lot of frees. But there's finally some good news in terms of freedom of speech online. And that comes in the form of a Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals decision that looks very promisingly like it would put an end to at least outright censorship on social media giants, who are increasingly being seen legally from a court's perspective and just in a general day-to-day public perspective as the new public forums, the new digital public squares online, where discussion should thrive. Twitter and Facebook and YouTube lose, the First Amendment wins. This is from Alex Berenson. A federal appellate court just blew up the absurd argument that the world's largest carriers of speech and journalism can censor views they don't like. Next stop, the Supreme Court. And this is a case where the federal appeals court, in this case the 5th District, struck a massive victory for freedom of speech in a brilliantly argued 90-page decision. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of a Texas law stopping the biggest social media companies from censoring their users.
Government censorship is one form of control. It is also possible for newspapers and other forms of communication to be controlled by private interests.
And the case surrounds HB 20, the Texas law, which was passed approximately a year ago, September 2021, that would prevent social media companies from banning users based on their political opinions, their ideologies.
I thought I told you to kill that story. It'll cost us a lot of advertising.
If that story goes out.
And it was passed by conservative lawmakers who've charged basically that social media companies are part of a dangerous movement to, quote, silence conservative ideas and religious beliefs. But this is not about conservatives versus liberals. This is about any type of dissent against basically the prevailing ideologies of the day. One of the Texas representatives said at the time, at this point, a small handful of social media sites drive the national narrative and have massive influence over the progress and developments of medicine and science, social justice movements, election outcomes, and public thought. The ruling will likely be appealed to the Supreme Court, setting a hugely important battle. If the High Court confirms the Fifth Circuit's view, companies like Twitter will mostly lose the power to censor their users for legal speech. If not, their censorship could become even more aggressive.
And if books and newspapers and the radio are efficiently controlled, the people will read and accept exactly what the few in control want them to.
So this temporary victory over the Texas House Bill 20 that prevents social media companies with more than 50 million viewers from censoring based on political and speech opinions is probably going to go be tested at the Supreme Court, and what's decided there could affect the entire span of discourse and free speech on the internet. Because if they affirm that yes, these social media platforms are carriers of the public message, are basically forums and public squares, then their ability to limit speech will be severely curtailed, as I believe it should be. On the other hand, if they strike down this decision and poke at whatever its flaws might be and come up with an alternate view of things, it could embolden them that they would have a right to shut down other people's free speech on the basis of their free speech. And at the heart of the issue was the argument on the side of social media giants that it is their First Amendment right to censor and shut down things they don't agree with because it's their platform, publicly open but privately owned. On the other hand, the lawyers in this case have argued that no, censorship is not an expression of their free speech. It's mainly a curtailment of the user's free speech, the Davids in this Goliath scenario. And so Berenson talks about how it's common and mostly directed at conservatives at this point, but in another political cycle, it would be targeted at liberals. And then I guess things would flip, and conservatives might cheer curtailing free speech and liberals would decry it. I think everyone should have free speech, and that shouldn't be the way to win arguments, is to just shut down people's ability to make those statements and reach people. And that they've also been targeting, as you know, people who are skeptical about COVID interventions and vaccines. Basically, you can't even talk about that issue or even use those terms on YouTube, not in a critical way, without being shut down and censored, or at the very least buried.
A community rates low on an information scale when the press, radio, and other channels of communication are controlled by only a few people. And when citizens have to accept what they're told.
Social media companies have successfully argued in other cases that their own First Amendment rights allow them to clamp down on users with opinions they don't like. For instance, in a little-known 2018 case, a lawyer for Twitter told a judge in the San Francisco circuit that the company had a right to censor black people and other protected groups. Does Twitter have the right to take somebody off its platform if it does so because it doesn't like the fact that the person's a woman or gay, etc., etc.? And they said the First Amendment would give Twitter the right, the lawyer said. However, in this most recent case involving the Texas law, Judges Andrew Oldman and Edith Jones rejected that view, distinguishing between the company's ability to say what they like, including commenting on users' posts, and their right to censor. The judges noted that the issue of discrimination based on political viewpoints is even larger than social media companies. It would extend basically to mobile phone companies, email providers, even banks canceling the accounts of people sending emails, making calls, spending money who might support disfavored political parties, causes, candidates, issues. And we've already seen this nightmare play out during the stuff in Canada with the truckers. People supporting the truckers had their bank accounts shut down across international borders because the Prime Minister of Canada didn't agree with their form of protest. It's outrageous. And the fact that this is all global is only making it more complicated. But Americans' recognition and right to free speech has been seriously curtailed here. And the chilling of free speech, it's affected my life personally, definitely. But it just makes the whole thing up and down. You know, you feel like you can't talk about certain topics because, you know, the bread on your table, your ability to make ends meet and keep a roof over your head may depend on whether or not a social media company has a certain word in their search terms that they're flagging for certain issues. In some cases they do have real people watching your videos, but overall what they start with is a computer algorithm that's just looking for key terms and flagging them and shutting them down. So it's not like it's even being taken into context of whether or not your dissent is justifiable, okay? And it's not a case where the law has been broken. It's just a case where opinions are not welcome and they get labeled as misinformation or disinformation. And just because they rolled out those words, all of a sudden it's like you don't have a right to free speech. Well, that is now being challenged, but we've already been living under this environment and this atmosphere. And frankly, I think everyone in this audience, those who have been reached by this message, who are subscribed, because you weren't recommended this video, I can tell you that, not by the algorithms, you all know what I'm talking about. You've seen the censorship, the pulling down of videos. You've seen how hard it is to find, even just as an example, hypothetically, dissenting information about certain issues.
So then you got top stories, and that's all official mainstream sources. CNBC, Time, CNN, Washington Post, CNBC again, Scientific American, Wall Street Journal. So that's all official news, right? Billions of search results over 25% of people who use Google, which is the #1 search engine, they literally click on the very first link that is offered to them. They don't even look at the second or third option. And they found out that by the time people get down to the 10th result, there's only a 2.5% click-through rate. So hardly anyone is going past the 10th result. We're constantly being told that the internet is just this ever-growing, vast digital universe of information that just stretches on and on, right? There are now almost 2 billion websites in existence. And when you search for something online, you are confronted with results numbers that are that massive.
Mel did a video a couple months ago, and then Bright Insight did a video about it, bringing up again, if you go to these search engines, Google being one of the search engines, Bing being another, DuckDuckGo being another, and you search for controversial topics, political topics, you will find authoritative mainstream sources for the first several dozen pages of results.
Do this experiment, check it for yourself. And so I'm gonna replicate what was posted there. This person did a search for climate change, which is something that should have quite a bit written about it. Okay. This says there are 868 million results. But let's look at this for just a second. First of all, this is the top part of the page that comes up. And if you really take a look at what you're looking at here, almost everything you're looking at comes from one source, the UN. So you have the effects of climate change from the United Nations. Down here you have the causes, also from the United Nations. The definition, also from the United Nations. Actions from UN Act Now. IPCC, World Meteorological Organization, that's also the UN. You have United Nations Environmental Program. In fact, the only thing right here that I'm immediately seeing that is not the UN is Environmental Defense Fund. Everything else that they are showing you right here looks like all these links, all these things you can click on. It's so many things. No, this is basically one source, what you're looking at. So it's not thousands of results or hundreds of results or even a dozen here. It's basically one thing, one source.
Something like climate change, you'll find official United Nations sources and very little, if any, sign of dissent, of side opinions, of counter arguments about this. And if you dig further and further into the search results to the supposedly hundreds and hundreds of pages, you'll find those results are not actually listed, and if anything, they just repeat the same information, maybe reposted on different sites, the same type of authoritative, curated, cultivated information.
But it says up here, right, that we have 868 million results. That's a lot. So that's not going to just be these people, right? So let's find out. Let's go all the way to the end. Let's go all the way to the end of these. Okay, so that's the last page. So we're on the 43rd page, and now we have 422 results. What happened to the billion results they claimed they had about this topic? Where did those millions of pages go? Between the first page and this page, where now there's only 422 results and I just scrolled through them all, and that's it.
With individual dissent or even just individual bloggers discussing the issue, just, hey, I was at this rally, hey, I held up a sign. You can't find that stuff easily. So where is it? What if those people have a point about any topic? What if you don't agree with it, but they have a great point that people should be discussing? You know, why is that stuff buried, and why should these social media giants have, discretion just to take it down? There are no other places where these conversations are happening.
I have actually done experiments on our own channel where I will, in quotes, paste in a title of a controversial video, and I will put quotes around it, and I will paste it into the search box, and you cannot find that video. It's like they lost it. It's just lost somewhere. I have scrolled down. Sometimes I will find it. It'll be like 146 videos down the list, and finally it pops up. They can find things, they can promote things, and they can lose the hell out of some things. and you watch a channel grow and change the way that we've watched our own channel evolve over the years, you can literally sit and watch the patterns of your work getting screwed with in real time.
And there's no denying that this is an important issue. If you can't discuss a topic, be a dissenter on it, or raise an objection to the things going on, then there is no free speech for anyone, really. If they only allow people who are saying non-controversial things to speak out, there is no free speech. If it's not controversial, there's no reason to even have a law at all. The founding fathers pointed that out. Others have. But this is not just a hypothetical discussion. This has actually been happening. You know, among the hundreds of others, the Babylon Bee was censored by Twitter because they talked about a controversial subject. And they're a parody site. Zuckerberg has been part of Facebook curtailing the users that it allows, the type of content, and at the same time they were wrapped up in the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where they were grabbing data in huge ways and making individual psychological profiles about each individual person that they had gathered data on in order to then sell those packages to political campaigns with multiple points of data suggesting whether they would actually support this candidate or whether they would support opposing that candidate's opponent, or whether they just wouldn't be interested in voting, or what type of profile they had, and they were selling that and using it to win campaigns. And that data was, you know, it was collected unethically. These social media platforms, for all their faults and for all their benefits, have connected billions of people across the internet, and on a variety of topics, both political and apolitical. They've become the de facto public discussion place. People, particularly in younger generations, do not tend to read newspapers anymore, and online articles from mainstream news sites to independent blogs tend to be picked up by people who share them on social media. But the past couple years, independent bloggers, independent content producers, just like Truthstream Media and all kinds of other outlets, have been severely suppressed. Okay? Many content creators have been kicked off of platforms altogether for discussing controversial issues. Others have had their recommendations taken away in the algorithm that's basically buried them and made them extremely hard to reach a significant audience and to make a difference in larger discussions.
And there's questions there. I mean, is it a consequence of the curation of this information in this very slanted, one-sided way? The learned helplessness of just resigning one's own intellectual curiosity to the Borg and just passively accepting whatever we're told about every single thing because people are starting to get afraid to even ask questions now.
We know that the public platforms of the internet, we know that social media is effective in communicating, because Eric Schmidt himself discussed in his book, along with his co-author, how the internet and various social media platforms, including Twitter, might be useful in provoking revolutions in Iran, for instance, velvet revolutions in Eastern Europe. Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen say digital insurgencies will bring down autocratic leaders. Well, again, that gets back to the Arab Spring stuff.
I was in the streets of Egypt, and I asked a young person, I said, what got you into the streets? He said, I would have just watched this on Al Jazeera. And then Mubarak shut my internet down and made this my issue. Pushing
political issues that aren't wanted by the ruling regimes there, and pressuring dissenters and encouraging them to basically rise up using the internet to get those points across, right?
A lot of young people view the freedom to connect as a fundamental human right. And when the government shuts everything down and you're completely unable to communicate with your peers and get access to information and each other, you run the risk as a government of turning something into an issue for people that otherwise would have watched on the sidelines.
So we know it can be done, and it has been done, or at least proposed, by these social media and data companies for use outside of the United States in kind of troubled regions, right?
There's no doubt that technology had an impact, most importantly as an accelerant.
But if it worked there, what's going on inside our country with the suppression of information? Is the opposite happening, that the status quo and the selected preferred authoritative candidates can't be defeated because dissent can't mount, they can't gather, they can't have a forum that shows how many people are for it. Other people aren't being recommended their arguments, and they aren't seeing videos exposing the misdeeds of certain candidates or the problems with certain issues or its very unconstitutionality. You know, how can there be free speech if the dissenting side is invisible, okay? Whether they have good points or not.
Hundreds of frontline medical professionals, scientists, researchers who dare to speak out against the official narrative, gone. Disappeared from social media. They didn't ask approved questions. They didn't come to approved conclusions.
Google, their famous search engine, and YouTube, which is one of their subsidiaries and a host of their other products, have specifically dedicated themselves to, since 2019 and 2020, to specifically raise or elevate high quality content and authoritative sources where it matters most, especially when dealing with news, recent events, crises, controversial issues, science and medical misinformation topics, and the like. And they've specifically dedicated themselves to reducing the spread of potentially harmful information where they normally would feature or recommend content. For example, when a user is looking for a specific medical information or advice, Google and YouTube say they want to provide content from authoritative sources like health professionals and medical organizations, and they basically fail to recommend or de-rank low-value information sources that are not considered trustworthy unless people specifically search for them. And believe me, it's a pretty specific type of search.
And everything that doesn't fit into this carefully built, carefully propped up, promoted image, or heaven forbid, goes against the accepted narrative that the majority seems to be on board with at any given time, or even questions that narrative, right? Then you get locked up in the digital no-no closet and buried in the algorithm or black holed altogether.
And Google, alongside YouTube, here in their 2020 white paper, Information Quality and Content Moderation, discuss the effects of their policies so far, stating that reducing recommendations of borderline content and harmful misinformation just on YouTube alone has resulted in a more than 70% average drop in the watch time of content coming from potentially harmful, potential misinformation sites, when at the same time the watch time for trusted authoritative sources has gone up over 60%. They've been using their new policies, in other words, to disenfranchise independent, non-authoritative bloggers, whether they're right, wrong, whether they have strange ideas, or whether they're right on point. They've been de-ranking them, and they have, as a group, have been getting over 70% less watch times and views, while they've been artificially promoting mainstream news sources that are considered authoritative.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish things that simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
And when you look into that policy, community guideline policies about the things that are not allowed because they're dangerous, harmful, illegal even, and those are listed. But what YouTube and Google take on in this white paper are content producers that are not in breach of those community guidelines, but are maybe close. Now that's a dangerous, slippery slope. Basically, in this paper, Google and YouTube admit that they're downgrading the views and recommendations in the algorithm to demote and lower the watch time of borderline violators, people who don't actually violate the community guideline contents but aren't considered authoritative and trustworthy sources. Now, this doesn't matter nearly as much when it's a channel that is dedicated purely to entertainment, to jokes, gags, talking about pop culture. But for channels that discuss news and information, history, science, medical content, they're getting slapped down very, very hard. At the same time that Google and YouTube are basically almost insisting users first check out BBC and Fox News and CNN and other major news networks.
The Trusted News Initiative was founded in 2019 by UK's state broadcaster, the BBC, and its global media and big tech partners.
And so that whole sort of search engine optimization stuff that's been done on the web for many years to help draw clicks and bring viewers into your websites and channels has now switched over to Google's policies of expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness.
When a competent observer looks for signs of despotism in a community, he looks beyond fine words and noble phrases.
One nation.
And when you get into what that means, how it's defined, it's information or content that quote unquote helps users, is created by an expert. So if you're not an expert, how can you become an expert? Well, through experience, but you can't get experience if you're not posted on an authoritative site. You have to be trustworthy, which basically revolves back around in a circular fashion to being trustworthy because you're posted on an authoritative site and you're someone with credentials, right? So in my view, while a lot of these practices of journalistic expertise and citations and references and methods, sources, that sort of thing are well and good and a good sign to have from authoritative established sources, there are also qualifications that just shut down individual dissenters, people who live in this country who have opinions about what's going on, who have first-hand accounts perhaps, who have done their own research and study like we do on Truthstream Media and even cited their sources. Do we get promoted in the algorithm or labeled as trustworthy after we cite sometimes hundreds of scholarly sources, or often at least 10 or 20 on many of our major works? No, we don't get credit for that.
The TNI issued a warning in 2019 that anti-vaxxers are gaining traction across the internet, requiring algorithmic intervention.
This is a very troubling issue, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It does seem like this issue has been set up because it needs to fail. We can't have a world moving forward with free ideas and everything possible online, but social media companies that are so big and so powerful and so restrictive that you can't actually think outside of the box. Obviously, illegal and disgusting things shouldn't be allowed on the internet. You can't prey upon minors and vulnerable people and break the law. But those issues and certain extreme political cases and stuff are not good arguments for shutting down the dissent of everyone else. They're not good arguments for denying the free speech process that was outlined in this country's founding. But remember, this country was never supposed to be just a closed bubble. It's supposed to be sort of a light to the rest of the world, to show the rest of the world how it should open up and involve people more in the process of government. And above all, even if you can't pick your leadership or change the laws of your country, you better damn well at least be able to speak out about it.
A community is low on a respect scale if common courtesy is withheld from large groups of people on account of their political attitude.
And if you hold up a sign in the literal or figurative public forum of your place of locality, you better be able to be seen by the people around you.
I mean, let's just click on a random page, page 34. What do we have? We have duke.edu, Nat Law Review, the California government, Bloomberg.com, Boston.gov, Reuters. Do you see this?
If you can't see the dissenters on any major issue, you know you're not living in a free country, a free zone online, or a free place of any kind. If you are not hearing from dissent, even if you think they're ridiculous and silly, then you know you're not free.
Where's Bob's blog? Where's anybody's blog? Where's anything that's not one of these official like EPA.gov and IPCC and Nature.com and the Wall Street Journal.
If all you're hearing are things that reinforce the official ideas, yes, this is the worst crisis yet. Yes, the only thing done will be to get more power and do things more globally. Consortium of global leaders from corporate America and certain United Nations and monarchs still existing. You know, if you have that kind of thing going on and you're not hearing from other groups, that should really raise some flags.
What happened to the internet? Where's the rest of it? Where's the billions of results that supposedly exist that has everything as far as the eye can see, right? Where did it go? Where is it?
Hopefully, this Texas decision will spread. It won't be a Texas or conservatives thing. Hopefully people will realize that banning users' speech online is not good for any part of our country or our conversation. It makes for very bad and very toxic politics. Yes, things have gotten extreme in recent years. The internet itself and the way it fuels debate, especially on Twitter. Remember that one guy talking about they deliberately introduce opposites.
They're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology.
The short-term dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. That is truly where we are.
It literally changes your relationship with society, with each other.
It is eroding the core foundations of how people behave by and between each other. If you feed the beast, that beast will destroy you. If you push back on it, we have a chance to control it and rein it in. And it is a point in time where people need to hard break from some of these tools.
And for years, I've watched these patterns unfold. Anyone who's had to do work online becomes pretty accustomed to data patterns. If you even mildly pay attention, you can see what's happening. You can watch it unfold. If you talk about what the algorithms promote, or what I would call, quote, non-threatening to the box topics, things that don't threaten the box, you can get millions of followers and have your stuff promoted everywhere, all over the place. But if you attempt to use this space to have serious conversations about controversial things or ask the sticky questions, then you just get your channel buried. You get your videos gagged, hogtied, and stuffed in the digital basement. You essentially get put in a cyber chamber so tiny it doesn't even really echo. Cyber purgatory.
Things have gotten rather strange and extreme, but that is not a good argument for shutting down free speech. It needs to be restored, and hopefully if this does go to the Supreme Court, those justices, with whatever their personal biases are, will see through that and see for the greater good. You know, these companies are very much like common carriers. They're the telephone companies, the telegraph companies of our day, but they're more complex too because algorithms weren't part of that system in a previous time. But all that needs to be figured out, and free speech needs to win the day. Can you imagine picking up the telephone and having your conversation just ended, being hung up on because the telephone company doesn't agree with your opinions when you're talking to another person? Or can you imagine a husband suspicious of his wife calling up the telephone company and saying, "I know you're associated with my wife, you seem to be very close with her"? No, they're just carrying the phone call, and whoever she might have called and whatever she hypothetically did in this example has nothing to do with the carrier. No one sees opinions posted on Facebook, on Twitter, or videos on YouTube and assumes that they're endorsed by these companies. In fact, they have all kinds of statements making clear to the contrary that they're not responsible for this content. But at the same time, these platforms are putting up their little notifications. Here's more context. Someone talked about a controversial issue. Read this official authoritative source about it. Well, they can do that, but people can't freely talk about it because they find themselves banned, they get strikes, they're buried, they're not recommended in the algorithm, and their own supporters, as we have personally seen, can hardly find them.
I mean, our channel, I've watched our channel get picked apart by the vultures. And depending on what's going on at a certain time, stuff will get dug up that was put up on here 8 years ago so that it can be deleted, because now it's inconvenient to talk about that, even though it's totally, we have gone out of our way on this channel to put up things that are backed by sources. We have tried to cite ourselves, sometimes excessively so, especially if what we're talking about is extremely controversial.
The words misinformation and disinformation were evoked so you can't talk about controversial subjects, and you certainly can't have dissenting opinions, not if they're deemed potentially harmful or close to violating policies. Are you freaking kidding me?